Hello and welcome back to another episode of Study Sessions. My name, of course, is Mr. Boff, and in today's episode, obviously released to coincide with this week's homework from the exam preparation booklet, our focus is on Caroline Duffy's poem War Photographer, a poem that is a haunting reflection on the emotional and the moral effects of war. Through her depiction of the photographer in the poem, Duffy invites us as readers to question what happens when we witness suffering but remain detached, when pain becomes just another image. Now, as always with these episodes, we're going to be thinking about the poem's big idea, we're going to be thinking about title analysis, and then moving on to a series of key quotations. At the end of today's episode, I'm also going to give you some ideas for interesting points of comparison with other poems from the poetry anthology. Now, starting with the big idea from War Photographer, at its heart, it is a poem that explores the psychological and also the ethical and moral consequences of war, not only for those directly caught up in it and involved in it, but also crucially for those who observe war from a distance. It's a poem that examines trauma, guilt, and a kind of moral numbness, revealing how war can erode or wear away our capacity to feel compassion and empathy towards others. Duffy seems to suggest in the poem that witnessing horror again and again and again doesn't actually strengthen our capacity to feel compassion, it actually weakens it. Now, moving on to the title analysis. The title War Photographer sounds impersonal. It's almost like a job title you might read on a form. And I think that that's deliberate. Remember, there's no name, there's no individual identity, there's no emotion. It's just a role. And so by making this particular choice as poet, Duffy highlights how war reduces people to a kind of function. And it also simultaneously reduces suffering to spectacle, something to be gazed at, something to be gawped at. The title mirrors the detachment that photographer feels. He is out there recording death, but he cannot himself intervene. So even before the poem begins, we as readers sense a very uncomfortable tension, a tension between duty and morality, a tension between documenting war and feeling compassion towards those involved in it. Now let's turn to our first quotation of today's episode, which is, quote, "Spools of suffering set out in ordered rows." Now, this opening image immediately introduces the central paradox or challenge of the poem, the attempt to organize chaos. The hissing sibilance of spools of suffering evokes at once the hush of the darkroom, but also the sinister whispers of pain and suffering itself. The photographer arranges the film, these ordered rows, and therefore by extension, the horrors of war itself, into neat, seemingly ordered rows, trying in a sense to make meaning and sense of and from suffering. But that word suffering breaks through the order. That's why I described it as something of a paradox. The pain in the line seems to seep through. For all of the ordered rows, ultimately on those spools, is suffering. So Duffy here presents a photographer as both simultaneously a creator and a mourner, someone who is trapped between control and compassion. Which leads us on neatly in many ways to our second quotation, quote, "All flesh is grass." Now, this is a direct biblical allusion. It's taken from Isaiah in the Old Testament, and it reminds us that all human life is transient, it's temporary, and it's fragile. And by consciously, purposefully using religious imagery, think of church, mass, priest, and so on, and now this line, "all flesh is grass," Duffy suggests that photographing war, being a war photographer, is almost like a kind of dark ritual. And yet this seems to be a world devoid of redemption, lacking in any kind of redemption. So this verse that once celebrated divine creation is used here instead purposefully to mark human destruction. War, Duffy seems to imply, turns sacred transient life into something utterly disposable, reducing people to the very dust they came from. Now, another key quotation, the third of this episode, is short and it feels deliberately abrupt. Rural England is the quotation. And there is a moment of stillness in this line after the chaos of Belfast, Beirut, and Phnom Penh. The contrast between the war zones and, quote, rural England exposes that huge gulf, the chasm that exists between people suffering in war, and the safety that we in England take for granted. At home, pain, of course, is, to quote the poem, ordinary, something, quote, simple weather can dispel or remove or get rid of. And Duffy uses this contrast to criticize the privilege of distance, how people like us in peaceful countries can so easily, effortlessly, seemingly ignore the agony and suffering of other human beings. And we move on in quotation 4 to a half-formed ghost. And it's in this quotation that Duffy blends the literal with the symbolic. So the phrase literally describes the developing photograph. The image is not yet clear, but it also captures the photographer's emotional haunting. The ghost represents both the dead stranger and the guilt that clings to the man behind the camera. He is, in a sense, haunted by what he's seen and what he has failed to change. So war's effect here, and that is this week's question focus, the effect is psychological. Memory becomes a spectre, a ghost that refuses to fade and go away. Okay, our fifth quotation from the poem and our fifth quotation in this episode, quote, "The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers." Now, this line is Duffy at her most biting, okay? In many ways, her most critical. And that verb prick suggests only a brief surface level emotion, most fleeting sting of guilt and maybe a little bit of compassion. And by placing tears with bath and those pre-lunch beers, Duffy is satirizing how Western readers like us, consume war like a form of light entertainment. We might feel momentary pity. We might get to enjoy the privilege of feeling a little bit of upset, a little bit of compassion. But our comfort, our comfortable lives, our baths and our pre-lunch beers cushions us from real, direct empathy with those suffering in war zones. War then becomes just another headline, another, at least in our modern world, another image scrolled past and quickly forgotten. And so our final quotation, our sixth of the episode, quote, "He stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care." The final couplet closes the poem with chilling detachment. That adverb, impassively, shows a degree of emotional numbness. The photographer has seen too much to seemingly feel anything anymore. But the pronoun they shifts the poem's focus outward onto us as readers. Duffy ends with that collective accusation. We do not care, okay? They out there do not care. We as readers, perhaps, do not care. And that repetition of emotional emptiness mirrors society's moral fatigue. War, Duffy seems to suggest, damages not just those in battle, but those who choose a kind of unfeeling indifference. So, to wrap up our reflection and thinking deeply about this poem, it is a poem war photographer that exposes a world where compassion fades away or can't really compete with comfort, and where truth, though captured, often goes unseen. So the poem war photographer becomes a mirror for us as readers Do we look or do we turn away? And if we turn away, what does that say about us? Now, if we think about this poem in comparison to other poems in the anthology, thinking about the effects of war across other poems in the Power and Conflict cluster, we want to be focusing on how different poets reveal war's lasting emotional and also moral consequences. So we might, for example, turn to the poem Remains by Simon Armitage. Both War Photographer and Remains explore psychological trauma. Duffy's photographer is haunted by the faces that he's captured. Armitage's soldier in the poem Remains is haunted by the man he's killed, probably armed, possibly not, the looter of the first stanza. So each poem reveals how memory itself becomes a kind of psychological battlefield long after the fighting and war has ended. If we turn now to the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen, think about how Owen's soldiers suffer both physical and spiritual torment. They are physically tormented by the merciless iced-east winds that knife us, but they're also spiritually tormented, for love of God seems dying. Duffy's pain in War Photographer is emotional and detached, but both poems, that is, Exposure and War Photographer, share a sense of futility and a kind of numbness, war as an endless, painful erosion of humanity and our capacity to feel. Turning now to Bayonet Charge, another of the key war poems in the anthology, Bayonet Charge by the poet Ted Hughes. Now, if we're thinking about this poem, Hughes captures the soldiers' very immediate and chaotic panic. Think about the final line, his terrors touchy dynamite. Duffy's horror in War Photographer is very different. It's slower and more reflective. Even so, both poets, that is Ted Hughes and Carol Ann Duffy, show individuals stripped of control, the way that war dehumanizes those involved. Okay, Poppies now by Jane Weir. And like Duffy, Jane Weir writes from a civilian perspective. Now, her speaker, quite possibly from the point of view of a mother sending her son off to war, grieves privately, while, of course, Duffy's photographer suppresses emotion professionally. But both show how war's effects, those emotional, those spiritual, those psychological consequences, reach far beyond, well beyond, the battlefield of war itself. And then finally, Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, rather differently, Tennyson in his poem celebrates sacrifice and duty. Honour the Light Brigade, honour the charge they made, noble 600. Don't forget that in War Photographer, in rather stark contrast, Duffy questions sacrifice, questions duty. Is it worth it at all? But together, when we think about both poems, they show a kind of important historical shift, a shift from 19th century patriotism in Charge of the Light Brigade to a very 20th and 21st century disillusionment with war and conflict in War Photographer. So when you think about War Photographer, when you're completing this week's homework, remember, Duffy doesn't show us war itself. She shows us its echoes, its psychological and emotional echoes. The lasting effects of war are violence, guilt, and indifference. And her final message in the poem is as sharp and as harsh as the clicking of a camera's shutter. Even when war ends, the images and seemingly our apathy remain. So, as always, thank you so much to everyone who listens to these episodes. Thank you so much for listening. Do make sure that you are subscribing to the podcast, particularly if you're listening to this on YouTube. And please make sure you also like and review where possible on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I will see you as ever after the October half term on the next one.